Hi everyone, I hope you're well, and thank you to everybody who interacted and commented on my previous white balance videos. I did try to answer all the questions in full that people had, but it seems that a lot of people found those videos really helpful, and so I'm going to continue to produce some educational content. I do have to be a little bit careful there because I could talk for a long time on some quite technical subjects. And while some of you might love that, others I think would never watch the video in the first place. So I've got to play the YouTube game a little bit. And with that in mind, I'm going to produce a video now on 4 common mistakes that people make with their image edits. There are videos like this on YouTube. I don't know if any of them discuss some of the issues I'm going to discuss now. So I actually came up with this list by just scrolling through the Flickr Explore feed, which I haven't been on Flickr in forever, but I thought that'd be a good way just to come across a real mix of photography, and sure enough, there were these errors. And for me personally, I've been doing this long enough that these kind of errors really jump out at me. It can be some of the first things I'll see in an image are the sort of technical mistakes, which can really be quite jarring. So I'm going to talk about 4 things. The first is black mountains. I'll explain what that means in just a second. The second is halos, which most of you will be familiar with, but I'm going to talk about how they get created and how you can avoid creating them, some alternate processes. Then I'm going to talk about the Orton effect, which technically isn't an editing mistake, but I think it ends up as being a mistake in a lot of cases. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, a really specific one, which is grey suns and how you can avoid doing that. So hopefully you'll find this interesting and educational. So let's get started. As I discuss these 4 issues, just try to follow along with the thought processes, understand how these issues come in, the kind of edits that are going to produce these problems, and the solutions that I'll explain. But if you try to get into the nitty-gritty of exactly how I'm moving every slider, then I think it will be hard to keep up. Unfortunately, I can't teach processing in a specific way and talk about these problems in the same video in a sort of coherent, fairly condensed way. So apologies there, but hopefully you can still follow along. So we're going to start by talking about this Black Mountains issue, and this is a photo from Iceland a few years ago. So I've got one of my workshop clients here giving a bit of scale to the mountain, and it was taken on a slightly dreary day, so we want to recover a little bit of drama in the clouds. It looks a little bit washed out as well, so we'll start by just darkening the exposure very slightly actually, and adding some contrast so that makes the mountain look a little bit better, because I think I'd slightly overexposed that shot. And then we're going to darken down the sky a bit to bring in some of that cloud detail. So let's drag a gradient over the sky, and we're going to add some contrast because we want to bring out any structure that's there in the cloud, and then just darken the exposure a bit. So let's make that a bit stronger so that we can really start to see the cloud popping out. One thing we don't want to do is excessively darken the sky because that's going to look really bad. So let's stop somewhere there. It still looks pretty natural. The sky looks good. The figure looks good. The general contrast looks good. But of course, I've made the top of the mountain here far too dark. And you can have this problem whenever you've got a subject sticking into the sky, whether it's a mountain or a tree or a building. It makes little difference. You can still make this kind of mistake. You can also effectively bake this error into your file if you were to shoot this kind of scene with a neutral density graduated filter. It's one of the reasons I really don't like those filters for mountain photography. It's too easy to make these mistakes, and it's really quite hard to fix them with post-processing. Okay, so that's our problem. How do we fix it? Well, the answer is really that we need to use these shadows and highlight sliders. But first off, I'm going to darken the exposure and add a bit of contrast, just as I did with the previous edit. And then I'm going to crush the highlights and boost the shadows. You will have seen me do this many times. And then the image looks really washed out, but we've actually reduced the contrast between the mountain and the sky more or less across this edge here. And there's no apparent halos, which is something I'm going to talk about in a second. So that's a good starting point, but it's all a bit washed out, lacking in contrast now. So we need to add more contrast, and then it's starting to look a bit better, but maybe it needs to be just a little bit darker. You do need to be careful with these adjustments. And then because we've added so much contrast, we've effectively added saturation, and it's looking rather oversaturated. In fact, if we make this really saturated, you completely lose the atmosphere of the scene. You kind of want it to look a bit dreary. So I'm just going to slightly desaturate this. And now the clouds do look better than where we started, but they're still lacking a bit of contrast and definition. So I'm now going to use the gradient tool. And the reason I'm using the gradient tool and not another method is we've run out of wiggle room with our highlights and shadows sliders. They're at -100 and +100. And incidentally, don't be too afraid about going to these maximums. If it looks right, it is right. So now I'm going to drag a gradient, this time diagonally across the mountain, a really soft gradient. So what I'm trying to do with these two gradient adjustments that I'm going to make is roughly follow the shape of the landscape. And then I'm going to make a very small exposure adjustment, so just 1/4 of a stop, and add a bit of contrast. And you can see that definition coming back into the clouds. It's starting to look really good. And then I'm going to do the same adjustment for the opposite side of the sky. So I'm kind of following the rough shape of the mountain there. And I'm just looking that over again to make sure that it looks about right. Maybe a tiny bit more contrast on the image overall. So let's just add a bit more contrast in there. And I think that looks about perfect. So we've fixed that problem of the dark mountaintop. Let's just compare the two approaches. So there's a really big difference in the realism of the result here, and that's one of the reasons that I really don't like this this black mountain issue that you see cropping up. So I'm very quickly going to repeat that process for you now with a different image. This one's taken up in the northwest of Scotland in Coyac. And we're going to start by doing this edit in the rather naive way. So I'm just going to boost the exposure, add a bit of contrast, and maybe a bit of saturation too, because I'd like to bring out these warm colors in the ground there. And then our sky is too bright, so we're going to drag a gradient over the sky, a bit close to where the sky is. Let's do that, and darken it until it starts to look good. So we probably need to go to, yeah, 1.5 stops, something like that. And the sky now looks pretty good to me. There's good definition and contrast. But of course, we've done a horrendous job with the mountains. We've given them black tops. In fact, this one on the right, Stack Poly, is particularly black. So we clearly want to avoid that. And we're going to fix this issue by going through exactly the same process as we did before. So I've got another digital copy of the file here. And I'm going to crush the highlights and boost the shadows again, just doing it plus and minus 100, and add some contrast because we need to recover some of the contrast that we lost through those highlights and shadow sliders. And then just boost the exposure until the ground is looking about right. And I think that's about right for the image as a whole. You can see that the sky still is a little bit too bright and lacking in definition. So once again, I am going to use a gradient. But compared to the last edit, it's going to be a much, much softer gradient. We're going to do just a tiny adjustment, yeah, 1/2 stop, less than 1/2 stop, and add a bit of contrast. And maybe move this a little bit higher, actually. And it's that left-hand side that's the brightest area, so we could even drag a big soft gradient like this, over that left-hand side. So I'm just going to reposition that, just so that it's more into that corner. And we're just going to do a slight darkening adjustment there too, just to add on to the adjustment that we made first. So I think that's about right for this image now. Again, a fairly quick editing process, but the difference between the two edits should be pretty readily apparent. There is a much more natural transition of brightness going on between the ground and the sky here, and some nice shadow detail. I mean, if we compare these two areas of the mountain, although we'll have to wait for it to load quickly, you'll see there's much better shadow detail in this correctly edited file. So that's a really useful approach to understand, particularly if you have these uneven horizons, whether it's trees or buildings or mountains sticking into them. Use your highlights and shadows sliders in combination with the contrast slider. And then if you do use gradients, try to use very gentle gradients, making small adjustments and then adding several adjustments if you need to. And that's the way to solve this problem. Next up, it's halos, and I actually don't have many good examples in my own work where I can show you halos, because of course I try to avoid them myself, but I did notice when I edited this this shot originally that halos were starting to appear. So I'm first going to do a really extreme edit that a beginner might do, and then I'll show you my edit where the halos are maybe a bit more subtle. So we're going to start by darkening the highlights and boosting the shadows, and let's just go the full whack, just so we can create a fairly extreme example here. So that's starting to create some halos, but because we want to see the textures a bit more in the rocks down here, we're going to play with this clarity slider. There's a bit of haze going into the distance, so let's do some dehazing as well. And then it's looking a bit dark, so let's brighten it up. And this is the kind of editing process that somebody who doesn't have a keen eye for these kind of artifacts might go through. And you can see very clearly now that the mountain edges here are darker than the main mountain itself, and that's happening on all of the mountains. And you can also see a glowing edge to many of these mountain faces, so it's actually brighter on the other side of that dark edge. It's also particularly noticeable up here to this right hand side, so you can see this bright patch just here, and then there's a dark edge on this side. So those are all halos. They look pretty bad to me, but when you combine them with all of these adjustments with the clarity and dehaze and so on, I mean, let's go really extreme here, then the image starts to look incredibly digital, really quite fake. And I'm often refer to this look as looking crunchy, which may or may not make any sense to you, but it sort of just looks, I don't know, gritty and horrible. And these are the kind of things that you can end up doing when you're not totally familiar with the kinds of effects these adjustments actually have. So let's go back to basics again and try and figure out how to edit this. Well, first off, if we do use these shadows and highlight sliders to their full extent, then you can see these halos start to creep in. They're more subtle, but this is already at a level where it would be slightly problematic for me, and I'd look for ways to correct this with Photoshop, which is a bit too advanced for today, but you can, if you wish to, if you've created these halos, go in and correct them. But I suspect many of you will be looking at this and even be thinking, what halo? Because they're sufficiently subtle maybe that you could get away with it. But once you start adding contrast and so on, then you start to accentuate them. So the first thing to do is, if you've got halos starting to appear in your images, recognize the kinds of adjustments that might cause them. So the highlights and shadow sliders will occasionally cause the appearance of halos. The texture and clarity and dehaze sliders, I mean, these are all pretty horrible things in my opinion, and I never use them. I have used them. I've experimented with them. I understand what they do, but I think they are far more likely to do harm than good to your images, particularly this clarity slider, which is way overused in my opinion. Superficially, it looks like it's doing a great job, but I don't know, it just looks terrible to me. So I'd strongly advise trying to learn your editing in a way that doesn't use these presence sliders in Lightroom, and just avoid them completely. Okay, so what we're going to do instead is we're going to use the highlights and shadows sliders, but we're not quite going to go all the way there. Then we're going to boost the exposure a little bit so that the foreground is correctly exposed. But we can see that the sky is a little bit too bright, so I'm going to drag a gradient in here. Then we're going to darken that gradient slightly, and you can see that we're starting to darken the top end of this slope more than the bottom, which isn't ideal, but I'm going to focus on what's happening to the sky because this is looking quite good now. And apart from this one localized issue, I think this all looks very natural, and we really don't have any visible halos appearing. So we can fix this area more specifically using Photoshop, but we could just have a go with the brush here, make sure that it's nice and soft. So let's turn the feather to 100, and we're just going to slightly reduce the brush size and then paint in an area here where we're just going to see if we can help to hide that darkening. So I'm just making a small adjustment there. Then I'm going to click off and click back on again and paint it in a slightly different area. And again, just a tiny adjustment just to brighten it. And by doing those two small adjustments, we've probably got this to the point where it's not really going to be noticeable at all, especially not to the casual viewer. So you might know it's there, but probably nobody else is going to notice it. And I think that this is now a pretty good place to leave this image, and I'd probably do a crop because I think that the image is improved by a crop. There's a bit too much foreground there. Get rid of that rock. Maybe come in a little from the left and the right. And that's a nice place to finish, I think. Okay, so that's halos. The big take home here is to just be very careful about how you use these sliders, and that you don't use them excessively or without considering how they might affect artifacts in your images, and particularly halos. Next up, it's the Orton effect, and this is essentially the difference between this image, which has very few edits and is really quite subtly edited, to this one, which has this glowy effect applied. So the highlights have a sort of more saturated glow to them to make it look a bit more magical and mystical. And in this case, I've applied the effect fairly heavily to illustrate the point. You can do it in a more subtle way, but nevertheless, for me, this is a mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is twofold. Firstly, I think that this kind of edit actually takes you away from the scene. So my enjoyment in photography is admiring the skill of the photographer in translating a real scene into a photograph that looks real and engages me in that way, but where I can also admire the skills of the photographer creatively in finding a composition that says something about the scene, and also in interpreting it using light in a way that I find engaging. So that for me is my appreciation of photography. And if you start applying these effects to try to elicit an emotional response from people just through a Photoshop process, then for me that isn't really art. But those are my personal views. And of course, some of you may choose to apply this edit all the same. So then there's the second reason why I wouldn't do this, and that's that I think that these kind of edits are kind of faddy. So they are not going to stand the test of time. I think in 10, 20 years, people will look back at images that have this very strong visual hallmark and say, ah, yeah, this was an image from 2010, 2015, 2020, when this style was popular. This kind of technique has been popularized by the super fantastical stuff that is so popular on social media, but I'm not sure really that the effect itself has any artistic merit, and I do think it's going to look dated. So that's all I'm going to say on the Orton effect, but do consider using it very, very carefully and very subtly if you do decide to go down that line. Last up is a problem with grey suns that people tend to create when they are shooting into the light and they have an incredibly high contrast scene like the one you see here. So this is shot in 2012 in Norway, and you can see I'm looking straight into the sun, and we've got these amazing crepuscular rays breaking over the ridge. So the thought process goes something like this. Well, the highlights are blown, so let's darken the highlights, and the shadows are a bit too dark, so let's boost the shadows. And actually the highlights are still a bit too bright, so let's just keep going with that. And I wonder if I can recover a bit more detail in the highlights, so let's just darken the whites down a bit, and then let's add a bit of contrast because we want to make everything pop. And then you end up with an edit something like this. So I see edits like this all the time where people have just been a little bit too heavy-handed and not had a really strong understanding of what these sliders actually do. So in this case, the edits have been taken so far that this blown out highlight area has actually turned grey, and I can illustrate that by just painting an incredibly bright adjustment over the top here. So that's white and that's the colour of the sun, grey, and that kind of thing looks really, really awful. So how do you avoid doing that? Well, really this is a matter of understanding how you want to handle blown out highlights and shots into the sun, how you actually want to render the image to make it look beautiful. And for me, the solution is to allow the highlights to be blown and then have a really beautiful highlight roll off with detail if you have some detail there. So let's re-edit this file. So I'm going to boost the shadows just like we did before, and I'm going to darken the highlights down slightly just to help to recover some detail, but I'm not going anything like as far as I was before. I'm going to add some contrast to make things pop a little bit, and actually the foreground is still too dark, so I'm going to add more brightness using the shadows slider. And then the cloud could do with maybe a bit more contrast, so I'm going to drag a gradient over the top of the image, and it's got that crazy brightening adjustment I just made. But let's darken that down and add a bit of contrast so we can see some nice cloud structure in there now. And then maybe we can even get away with a brightening adjustment at the bottom here. And again, I've got that huge change baked in. But I'm going to do a one-stop exposure boost, something like that, and then add some contrast so that I can keep those shadows fairly dark. And I think that now looks really beautiful. So you can see that the sun is completely blown out. It's got this real intense brightness to it that you can imagine you experienced when you were actually stood there. And that light's then spilling over the cliffs and lighting up this beautiful area in the foreground here. And the cloud is nice and dark and ominous with some good contrast and color to it. So that, compared to the more beginner edit, shall we say, is quite a significant improvement. But importantly, we don't have that gray sun in there. So hopefully you found these four mistakes and how to handle them helpful. Maybe you'll be able to find them in your own images. I suspect you will, because I could find a few of them in my own. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful, and please do comment if you have any questions. If you have anything that you'd like me to discuss in the future, also put it in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.